A Place for Lovers is a movie that I would probably never watch if I weren't doing the Faye Dunaway series. When you see the title of this movie, when you see that it came out in Italy in 1968, they called it Amanti there, you can probably hear the score for it in your head already. Maybe you more or less know what's gonna happen. That said, there's some interesting things about this movie. One of them is that there's interesting personnel. Alongside Faye Dunaway, there's Marcello Mastroianni, and the movie was directed by none other than Vittorio De Sica. But doesn't he make grim, neo-realist films, not fluffy, romantic ones? Well, De Sica's later career is actually pretty diverse, with historical films like Sunflower and The Garden of the Finzi Continis, with comedies like Marriage Italian Style, and with weird stuff like the American film Woman Times 7. I haven't seen any of those movies, but they are all really tempting. Let me know if I should watch one of them. I know someone has requested The Garden of the Finzi Continis, and I'm going to get to it one of these days. In some ways, you gotta respect De Sica for branching out, but not all of his efforts were entirely successful, including, probably, this one. There are 5 people credited for the screenplay for A Place for Lovers, including Tonino Guerra and Cesare Zavattini. Zavattini wrote some of the biggest neorealist films, like Bicycle Thieves and Umberto D., both of which directed by De Sica. Of course, they worked together all the time. When I was in college, we read a manifesto by Zavattini outlining the importance of having a commitment to reality and not letting some artificial story get in the way of what really matters. Well, they certainly don't let story get in the way in this movie. I don't think they really needed 5 people to come up with a screenplay. You could probably get a similar result with one middle school student. The film was produced by the legendary Carlo Ponti. It was shot by Pasquale De Santis, who filmed Death in Venice as well, and Cadaveri Cilenti, which was one of the very first movies I reviewed on this channel. He also did Christ Stopped at Eboli, which I'd like to see one of these days. The music is by Manuel De Sica, and yes, that is the director's son, which usually isn't a very good sign, and indeed the music is at best unremarkable. Manuel's mother is the Spanish actress Maria Mercader. Her name might sound familiar because her cousin, Ramon Mercader, assassinated Trotsky. Didn't see that one coming, did you? Did it with an ice axe. That probably would have been a much better movie than this. There's a couple songs here provided by Ella Fitzgerald. I'm going through the cast and crew in great detail here because I don't really want to talk about the movie, but I've just got one more person to mention, then we'll get to it, and that, of course, is, you guessed it, Theodora Van Runkel, who did the costumes for Dunaway. I mentioned her in the last video, and it probably won't be the last time that we hear that name. Of course, this movie came out the same year as the Thomas Crown Affair, last week's movie, and right after Faye Dunaway burst onto the scene in Bonnie and Clyde. She played Bonnie, I believe. Okay, let's cut to the chase. This movie is pretty widely panned. Maybe that implies that it's been widely seen, so let's say it's pretty consistently panned, but I actually don't think it's that bad. It definitely isn't a good movie. To me, it's just kind of nothing, unremarkable. But there are a couple of interesting things to talk about. The movie documents an experiment, let's say, an experiment by Julia, that's Faye Dunaway, who invites Valerio, Marcello Mastroianni, who is essentially a stranger. She invites him over to this mansion she's staying at in Italy, and she asks him if he wants to be part of an experiment where they spend 2 days together. And he says, "Gorsh." He says, of course. I'm not sure who would turn this down. This film is kind of billed as a steamy and romantic movie, but most of the intimacy takes place off camera. And if anything, the film is characterized by them continually being interrupted, looking for privacy, but not really being able to find it, looking for an escape, looking for a place for lovers, but finding that to be elusive. Life gets in the way, I guess. If you wanted to see this movie to see 2 stars in a steamy affair, you're going to be a little bit disappointed because it mainly is more focused on really boring stuff like making phone calls. It turns out that Julia has a deep, dark secret. I'm not going to spoil it for you, even though it's pretty dull and predictable, and I think the IMDb blurb says what it is anyway, but look, you didn't hear it from me. I won't reveal the big twist, I don't think. I promise to dig into the interesting parts of this movie. So first, let's talk about the character Valerio. You might expect him to be some kind of playboy because it's Marcello Mastroianni after all, but actually, he's kind of a shy and unassuming engineer. He spends his time talking about car safety. Actually, Julia is reminded of him because she sees him on TV talking about installing some barricades to make roads safer. I guess this is the exciting stuff they had on TV in Italy in the 1960s. Honestly, I actually like this part of the movie. I'm not sure why it's there, but it almost reads as some kind of commentary on car culture. Reminds you of Crash a little bit, maybe. As we continue on, we're going to see a lot more cars in this movie because it turns out that Valerio is more of a race car driver than an engineer, and he's not really as shy as you might first think. In fact, Valerio ends up being the film's moral arbiter in some ways. He also gets to have multiple vehicle changes, which is like a costume change, but for a man. So Valerio is kind of deprivileged at first, but then privileged in other ways. I think that's actually not too unusual for Mastroianni, kind of your humble local heartthrob. Movie star doesn't make much sense, but not too uncommon. In some ways, this really feels like a tourist film, a travel brochure, a movie about things and about cars and clothes, the houses in Italy. Not quite the same as neorealism. The fascination with houses in this film is so conspicuous, you wonder if they're trying to sell you a timeshare or if the movie was funded by the local chamber of commerce. In some ways, this isn't so bad, though, because the locations are one of the more interesting parts of the movie. The film partly takes place in Cortina d'Ampezzo, which is where what other famous movie was filmed? The Pink Panther. There's a cool Henry Mancini song from the score to that film called Cortina, one of the most underrated Henry Mancini tracks, in my opinion. Go check it out. We do see some interesting stuff here and there, like some people climbing up a mountain. Wow. We go to the Monza circuit. There's some interesting texture, but it's unclear what the point of any of this really is. Another interesting thing about the movie are the ethnographic undertones that sneak in. For instance, Julia and Valerio go to a party where someone talks about the erotic temples of India. He has 250 slides to share with the dinner guests. 250 slides. If you went to dinner and someone had 250 slides, I mean, man. This turns out to be some sort of high society swingers party. This scene, I think, is satirical. Probably. I mean, 250 slides, come on. Still, it's interesting that this fascination with India sneaks in. Later, Valerio will paint Julia's face in a vaguely tribal pattern, and at the end of the film, they're going to listen to a gospel record together and do an odd dance that kind of evokes prayer. I don't think there's too much to read into these moments. This was the tail end of an era where ethnographic vagaries had some social cachet. It was stuff you talked about at the cocktail party, I guess. Think about Egyptology. This fascination is happening at two levels, right? There's the characters in the film themselves who are fascinated by the Indian temples, the high society of the film, but at the same time, the people making the movie, well, they put this into the film. They must be fascinated with it to some extent as well. Today, these things just seem a bit weird. In this movie, I think it's relatively harmless and maybe even kind of cool to see these strange cultural crossovers. I don't know, maybe that's not the right perspective, but it's interesting to see it. Another thing that sneaks into the movie are interactions with servants, the working class. There's a butler at the first house, and when they go to the mountains, there's a caretaker who lives nearby. It's an interesting character, possibly with some kind of developmental impairment. At one point, Julia gives her one of her dresses, and Valerio later sees the housekeeper wearing it. It's one of the film's most poignant moments. Although the movie is maybe a little unkind to this character, it does have some poignant moments in it. This movie is without a doubt an upper-class story, and unlike the Thomas Crown Affair, where it seems like there's maybe some slight critical undertone, maybe just a hint of a critical undertone, this movie doesn't really seem to have that, doesn't seem to say much, or maybe I missed something. Don't think so. Interestingly, both of these movies share one pretty similar scene where the couple get groceries together, which is pretty romantic, but you don't see either one of them cook anything, I think. Both of these movies also feature some home movies, a 16mm camera, for instance. Valerio takes some footage of Julia possibly betraying the true motivations for the film itself. Did they just want to bring Faye Dunaway to Italy to caress her with the camera? Try to keep her there forever on film? Try to have her be a part of their little national pride and industry? I wish I knew a little bit more about the production history of this movie because it was an interesting step in Dunaway's career. She kind of blows up in Bonnie and Clyde, and then she decides the next step is in Italy. I'm not sure how the timing all worked out for all of this. Unfortunately, it's a weak role. For one thing, the movie is dubbed, and it creates a fairly big chasm. Sometimes it's not an issue for me, but I guess when you're doing the Faye Dunaway series, it's pretty conspicuous when her lips move, but someone else's voice comes out. Her character is American, but it's still dubbed. That was the practice at the time, of course. In theory, this could almost be a juicy role. I wouldn't say Faye Dunaway is miscast. Dunaway almost always plays somewhat doomed characters with a certain sense of personal disregard, and we have that here, but the role's way too melodramatic for there to be much acting in it. That said, I think sometimes Dunaway, melodrama is sometimes part of her thing in a way. As we go through the series, I'm thinking more and more about how Faye Dunaway interacted with classic Hollywood. And, she's kind of a glamorous character in a lot of films, but glamorous in a slightly subversive way. I'll refine that a little bit more next week, maybe. And she also has a little bit of a hint of melodrama in it. So there is some classical stuff working in her characters, but this movie is just way, way too melodramatic to get much of anything, too saccharine to get much of anything. Having said all that, I do think that Place for Lovers is actually slightly underrated. It's pretty boring, pretty pointless, but if you get to the end of it, it has some emotional salience and some scenes that are shot well. There are hints of the great films that this immense cast and crew had worked on. Still, I wouldn't recommend the movie unless you're doing the Faye Dunaway series. It's just too lightweight. There's a bunch of mistakes in it too. Now, look, I wouldn't call it like an amateur film, right? I've reviewed plenty of movies on this channel that are truly amateur, where they are just not put together coherently. This movie almost is incoherent. There's a few things that I didn't quite grasp. For instance, this house that she stays in the beginning, who does that belong to? It seems like it belongs to a countess, but at first she's there alone and kind of has the run of the place. But later she goes, there's a party there. Okay, Valerio always parks his car way at the end of the driveway. It's an old house that doesn't have a garage. But when they show up for this party, same place, okay, they park their car out by the garage, they walk all the way in, and then the house is full of people. Well, where did they park? I know this is a very American question. There are some things that don't quite add up. But like I said, not amateur. There are some people who say that this is one of the worst movies ever made. Those people, they got to watch more bad movies, I would say, because this isn't anywhere near as bad as some of the stuff that we've talked about on this channel. And let's be clear, this is a totally functioning movie. It's just kind of missing something, I would say. But it does actually have some nice moments, too. There's some stuff that is well shot. For instance, the scene after Valerio plays back some of the home movies. It's well put together, I think. I glanced at a review of this movie on IMDb. I just skimmed some of the reviews before watching it. Mainly the title. I don't like to actually read the text of it. That's too much for me. But just reading the title, that's enough. And one of the titles, it said, terrible movie, except for one amazing scene. And I thought, well, I guess I'll see what this scene is. Well, I watched the movie. I don't know what they're talking about. I don't know which scene they're referring to, because there's nothing that's going to blow your mind. But there's a couple things that aren't too bad. Anyway, next week, we will be back with another movie with Faye Dunaway in it, probably a relatively famous one, as I attempt to close in on 1,000 subscribers. Honestly, the thought crossed my mind this week, is this movie too obscure for the channel? Now that the channel's so massive, do we have to do bigger things? I don't know. I haven't totally answered the question yet. I don't know exactly what the future of the channel will be. I don't really expect it to grow much. But I do feel slightly different about that sort of thing than I did in the beginning. So let's just say for now, let's savor these obscure movies, the roots of this channel. I think there'll be more of these things, but I don't know exactly what the future holds. All that is certain is that we'll see Faye Dunaway again for a couple more weeks. If you've got any suggestions for movies with her in it, leave them down below. Got some good ones last week. I'll be watching at least one of those, I think. And yeah, let's see where it goes.